Why is the U.S. military building up its presence in the Caribbean? It recently targeted a Venezuelan boat that it said was carrying drugs. President Nicolas Maduro says the mobilization is aimed at his government. So what should we expect from the new tensions in South America? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Cyril Vanier. Tensions between the United States and Venezuela came to a head this week after Washington took the unprecedented decision of bombing a boat near the Venezuelan coast. The Trump administration said the vessel was loaded with drugs and gang members and posed a threat to the U.S. Venezuela's president denies those accusations and says his country is ready to defend itself. So what's behind this action by the U.S.? Is it about narcotics or politics? We'll get to our guests in a moment. First, though, this report from Imogen Kimber.
This is the moment a US missile hit a Venezuelan vessel in international waters. 11 people were killed. The US says the boat was carrying gang members and a lot of drugs.
There was massive amounts of drugs coming into our country to kill a lot of people. Obviously, they won't be doing it again, and I think a lot of other people won't be doing it again when they watch that tape.
Venezuela says it was an extrajudicial killing.
What the United States presented as a strike against drug traffickers was nothing more than an illegal massacre in international waters. They violated international law, they violated their own laws, and worst of all, they violated a basic human principle, the right to life.
The US Secretary of State defended the attack, calling it a legitimate strike.
If you're on a boat full of cocaine or fentanyl or whatever headed to the United States, you're an immediate threat to the United States. And the president, under his authority as commander-in-chief, has a right under exigent circumstances to eliminate imminent threats to the United States.
Leading up to the strike, the US had been increasing its military presence off the coast of Venezuela, with several warships, thousands of sailors, and a nuclear submarine. The Trump administration says they're on a counter-narcotics mission. Venezuela has responded by deploying troops on its border and coastline and encouraged people to enlist in civilian militias.
Because of this idea, I say to the imperialists of the North, we are prepared and we're going to fight. We're going to fight if you dare set foot in Venezuela.
If Venezuela were attacked, it would immediately enter a period of armed struggle. We would constitutionally declare the republic in arms.
Some fear the US is threatening President Nicolas Maduro's government. The US accuses Maduro of running a drugs ring. And in 2019, the US supported an attempted takeover by opposition leader Juan Guaido and applied heavy sanctions on Venezuela. The country suffered under economic pressure, but Maduro survived. President Maduro says Venezuela is now facing the greatest threat the continent has seen in 100 years and seems committed to fight on. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests now. In Merida, Venezuela, Paul Dobson is with us, independent journalist and political analyst. In London, Javier Farje, a journalist and Latin American affairs analyst. And in Stillwater, Oklahoma, Marten Brienen, associate professor at Oklahoma State University. He is an expert on security, organized crime, and drug trafficking, who served as director of Latin American studies at the University of Miami. A warm welcome to all of you. And I want to start with you, Paul, since you're on the ground in Venezuela. I wonder how Venezuelans are talking about this. How do they read what just happened?
There's been a very mixed reaction here on the ground. One sector of the population, the sector which traditionally backs the current government, has been almost literally up in arms about the attacks, the naval force of Venezuela's coasts, and the rhetoric which is now being employed by the US administration. However, this sector of the population is increasingly small within Venezuela. The highly unpopular Maduro government, an increasingly unpopular Maduro government, is failing in large extent now to bring its message to the Venezuelan people and to use this sort of saber rattling in the same way it has very successfully been used in the past. A much larger sector of the population today is essentially referring to the case of the boy who cried wolf. Many Venezuelans have heard both the previous government and the current government cry wolf about the imperialist threats of invading Venezuela and so on. And this story has, to some extent, fallen on deaf ears in a large sector of the population today, who are more concerned, let's say, about their less than $1 monthly wages, about their lack of a right to a trade union, about the persecution of protests, and a whole range of other economic measures which are hurting their day-to-day lives.
Javier, the U.S. president presents this attack on the boat as part of his broader effort to stop drugs from entering the United States. Now, you've told our team before the show that you're skeptical this is the real goal. Why?
Well, it's not only me, it's the World Drug Report of the UN, which specifically says that the majority of the drug trade that goes from Latin America to the United States goes via the Pacific. 80% of the drugs, especially cocaine, goes via the Pacific from ports in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Puerto Escondido in Mexico. Only 10% of those drugs go by the Caribbean. So it would have made more sense for Trump to send ships to mobilize the Pacific fleet in the Pacific to capture these boats. And second, it's a very, very important aspect. Why did they destroy the boat? Why didn't they board it? Which, according to international law, they should have boarded the ship, captured the cocaine, arrested the traffickers, the fleet, the crew, and parade them. We just have images of a boat being blown. According to Juan Gonzalez, who was an advisor of President Biden for the Western Hemisphere, in his social media, he was saying that there was questions about the legality of this action, but also about how real this actually happened. Of course, in Venezuela, many people are starting to speculate whether that happened or not. We could leave that aside, but assuming that it happened, that is the case. Not only that, I would go even further. President Gustavo Petro of Colombia, who's been very critical of Maduro because Maduro failed to produce any evidence that he won the election last year, he posted yesterday, saying that he would have been murdered somewhere. What happened would have been murder if it actually happened. And he said that those who transport drugs are young, poor people rather than the big barons. And he, on top of the footage that showed Trump describing this action, he said, and I quote, "This morning with the Colombian intelligence services, we captured 4.5 tons of cocaine south of Puerto Rico, with Dominican, Colombian, and Ecuadorian citizens being arrested." Basically, saying, look, this bombing means absolutely nothing, solves absolutely nothing if it happens, and makes the things even worse because most of the traffic from South America, especially cocaine, goes via the Pacific and not via the Caribbean.
You expressed doubts that the video might even be real. We'll come back to that in just a second. Paul, I know that you've got things to say on that, but Marten, I want to bring you into the conversation. You are the expert on organized crime and drug trafficking. What did you think when you first saw the video that Trump released?
Well, he sent a naval detachment last month. They weren't going to just float around. They were going to be doing something. I looked at that and I thought, well, I mean, it's true. It's true that the majority of the drugs that come into the United States come via Central America, Mexico, and out of Colombia, which is the primary purveyor of cocaine to the United States. The problem that you would have is that Colombia is also a friend in a way that Venezuela is not. So I suppose the only place where you could do something like this would be with Venezuela, because you can blow up a Venezuelan ship. Venezuela is not an ally of ours, is not a friend of ours. The regime is illegitimate since last year's, clearly fraudulent elections. And you're looking at a state that's very hostile to the United States, that we don't see as legitimate. And so we can't. What you can't do is go float off the coast of Mexico and blow up ships there. You can't do it, but you can do it off the coast of Venezuela, right? And it's a twofer, because on the one hand, you're showing Venezuela that you can do. You can say that you're doing something about drugs being smuggled to the United States, and Venezuela is a source of drugs being smuggled into the United States, even if it's not a very big one. And at the same time, you're sending a message to a very hostile regime about your military presence and your willingness to actually use it.
Right. So it's two things that you're pointing out. It's drugs and a political message. We were asking at the top of the show as if this is about narcotics or politics, and you're saying it's both. Look,
it's both.
You also said there were naval detachments that were sent, and I'm quoting you, they weren't going to be doing nothing. Now, the U.S. sent 7 warships, more than 4,000 troops, and this, including 2,000 Marines. I mean, that's a lot of Marines, and that's a lot of firepower, and that's a lot of military capability. And their opening act is what we've just seen, right? Is to pulverize the speedboat. Now, as Javier said, they could have stopped the boat. That's what normally happens. They could have stopped the boat. Mm-hmm. They could have seized any drugs on board, arrested any gang members if there really were gang members on the boat. I say if, because we haven't seen evidence. But they didn't do that. They chose to kill the 11 people on board. And Trump clearly explains that in his view, this is deterrence. We heard the quote earlier. He says, I'm going to say it again, obviously they won't be doing it again. I think a lot of people won't be doing it again. When they watch that tape, they're going to say, let's not do this. What are your thoughts on this new military drug deterrence, Trump style?
I mean, they will do it again. There's an awful lot of money to be made. That's the reality. I mean, drugs will continue to flow into the United States as they have done for a very long time, and we've thrown a lot of force at it. Before this, in the 1990s and the very early 2000s, it was an air bridge denial, Operation Air Bridge Denial, to stop airplanes from crossing into Colombia. Now it's this. It's not going to stop it, but there's very clearly a signal being sent here. And yes, you're right. This is not usually what one would do. And part of the problem here is that when you blow up a boat like this, then you will never have evidence of what was on that boat because it's gone. And which, there are all sorts of legal questions there that are quite complicated. But this is clearly about messaging, and I think primarily toward the Venezuelan regime.
Paul, on your end, you've told our team that there are elements of this attack that don't add up. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by this, Cyril, is essentially I'm struggling to understand what the U.S. administration gained from this attack. It's very clear what the Venezuelan administration gains from it. This has played right into the hands of Nicolas Maduro. Domestically, it's allowed him to intensify controls over a civil population. It's allowed him to persecute critics and push them either aside or into his camp, a tendency we've seen since the presidential elections last year, through which freedom of speech has been cracked down on, freedom of organization, freedom of protest, and a whole range of other attacks have been cracked down on. Internationally, it's also very clearly playing into Maduro's hand, as Javier pointed out. Critics such as Gustavo Petro, who has been very vocal in his damnation of the elections, the so-called elections here last year in Venezuela, are now coming out and defending the Maduro government. We're seeing also the Venezuelans being pushed back into the camp led by Moscow and Vladimir Putin, who has also been very vocal in backing Maduro in light of this attack. Remember that Maduro was, to some extent, cold-shouldered out of the BRICS organization last year, quite embarrassingly so for Maduro. And now we're starting to see these tensions with so-called allies starting to thaw. And this is all a result of Trump's tactics. So when we look at what Maduro benefits from this move, it's very clear, very obvious. What I'm struggling to see is what Trump gains from this. He spent a lot of taxpayers' money sending these submarines and boats to the South Caribbean. This is an attack which has raised many questions about his legality in international waters. It had an economic cost as well. And to blow up a tiny boat capable of holding 11 people. This is no This isn't going to flood the streets of New York with cocaine. This was a tiny, tiny operation, even if it was a drug operation. So this is the main element that I point to when I say things don't quite add up for me, because Trump is obviously causing polemic, we could say, by doing this. He must have something to gain. And here, my only thought, if I go through the almost impossible task of trying to put myself in Trump's head and understand his logic, which is nearby impossible today, given his sporadity and bipolar nature, and some have described it as being. But for me, this is not about politics. This is not about drugs. This is about economics. This is about, as we've seen Trump do in the past with the tariffs against China, against a whole range of other countries, this is about Trump trying to put himself in a position of strength to sit down at a negotiating table and work out a trade deal, which essentially, in Venezuelan terms, is about oil exploitation. We've seen the Venezuelan government grant a very dubious, untransparent, and unconstitutional trade deal to Chevron very recently for exploration rights and extraction rights for Chevron here in Venezuela. And there are numerous other trade deals on the table at the moment. So to me, this seems to be a negotiating tool, which is more about theatrics and actual content, which will allow the Trump government to push for better terms when it comes to allowing the penetration of US firms into the Venezuelan oil market.
Javier, this is one that I had not heard until right now. I mean, of course, there have been questions, and I think many of our viewers will understand those pretty intuitively. There have been questions about, is Trump pushing for regime change against Nicolas Maduro, a president, after all, whom he doesn't even recognize? Those are quite intuitive, right? When you station warships off the coast of a country. But this one about how it's maybe economic leverage, what do you think?
Well, yes, because Chevron, as Paul said rightly so, Chevron have been lobbying the United States government not to intervene in Venezuela because of the deal they have with the government. Not only that, last year, we may remember, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a delegation of parliamentarians from the United States visiting Caracas, who went to discuss with the government the possibility of an oil deal, considering the fact that Russia is at war with Ukraine, and also there was problems for the United States to get that supply. And also they don't want to use their own reserves. So yes, there's a lot to do with economics, because some of the accusations that the United States makes about Maduro are absurd. I mean, they accuse him of being part of a drug cartel. He's not part of a drug cartel that doesn't exist. And nobody has seen any evidence that it exists. Also, they have increased the reward from $25 million to $50 million for his head, if you like, between inverted commas. So yes, there is also an element of negotiating with Venezuela. Don't forget, Venezuela has the biggest reserves of oil on the planet, and oil is becoming extremely, extremely crucial in terms of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. So yes, I agree with Paul completely that there's an element of saying, look, this is just fireworks, but we are going to go beyond if you don't negotiate with us. So that delegation that was there last year, which never reached any conclusions, Maduro said at the time, look, we are happy to sell you our oil, but you have to lift the sanctions. Of course, there was no lifting the sanctions, and everything went back, to the way it was before. So yes, I believe that basically they want to negotiate a deal where the oil supplies, and Maduro will be happy to oblige.
Martin?
I think, I mean, it's comparable to a drone strike in a lot of ways. What this is projecting strength. It's saying to the Maduro regime, we have a naval detachment in your area, and we're not afraid to use it. At the same time, since they hit something really quite small, so they're trying not to escalate it too far. So yeah, there's negotiation tactic, there's projecting of strength here. That's what there is. But again, I think it's quite similar to a drone strike in a lot in ways. It's just
projecting
we have the ability. We have the ability to hit
to
you
what
if we
end,
want.
though? Because so the U.S. in just recent weeks, since Trump has come back to power at the beginning of his second term, the U.S. has declared that Maduro is the head of a drug cartel. They've designated that cartel as a narco-terrorist group, and then they've authorized military force against narco-terrorist groups. So if you connect all those dots, it's not very hard to see that if the U.S. were preparing, a legal basis for an attack, direct attack on President Maduro and his government, it could look something like this, which is why it's raising questions of, does Trump want regime change in Venezuela?
I'm sure. I think almost everyone wants regime change in Venezuela at this point. I think most Venezuelans do as well. He's deployed 4,000 troops to the region. That's not enough to invade Venezuela. I don't think it's anything quite like that. And I don't
Maybe
know.
You don't need to invade the country to force regime change. I'm just looking at the speculation that's out there.
It's really difficult to know, because with Donald Trump, one of the things that you have to not overlook is that a lot of what he does is aimed at a domestic audience. Like he's projecting strength also to American voters, to the American audience, and he's saying, like, I am actually doing something about the drug trafficking problem, and he's doing it in the one place where he could take an action like this, which is off the coast of Venezuela, because Venezuela is not a friend and is not a partner in a lot of ways, right? But and does it play into the hands of Maduro to perhaps to some extent, but I don't think Venezuelans take the crying wolf that seriously anymore. So it's difficult to know. There's a lot. What we can do is speculate, I guess.
Javier, this and Paul, actually, Paul, you were asking the question, how does Trump benefit from this? And Marten, this is what I was thinking when you were asking that question. The point that Marten just made, there is a fairly obvious way in which he benefits. It's U.S. domestic politics. I mean, Donald Trump has shown us that he has a lot of appetite, right, for using military assets when normally law enforcement would suffice. And he does this because this suits his political persona and his political messaging. He's deployed the National Guard famously or infamously in California. He sent the National Guard to the U.S. southern border. Now he's deployed them in Washington, D.C., wants to do the same in Chicago. Like, this is part of his M.O. So maybe, you were asking earlier, how does this help Trump? Maybe via Venezuela, Trump helps this latest action on the boat, burnishes Trump's credentials as a strong man at home.
Yes, and there's another element, Cyril, as well. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact, as a journalist, I'm always aware of this, that this attack happened on a day where the entire news cycle internationally, and probably domestically in the US, although I can't confirm this, but I would suspect so, was focused on someone else, was focused on Beijing, was focused, in fact, on three other people, on the Russian president, the Chinese chairman, and the North Korean supreme leader. Now, we all know that Donald Trump likes to be in the headlines. We all suspect that when he's not on the headlines, it irks him slightly. And I think the timing of this attack, when large sectors of the news cycle were looking east, were looking at supposed creations of new blocks of power, which opposed or counter the US block of power, should not be overlooked and has to really be taken into context when we're trying to analyze why Donald Trump took this decision. We should look at why he took that decision at that moment.
And Javier, as we look as we wonder where this may be headed, some will look to the fairly recent history, the late 80s, and say, well, the U.S. does have this track record where in Panama it sent 20,000 troops to remove the leader at the time, Noriega. Could they be doing something similar? Could they be drawing inspiration on the Panama precedent here in Venezuela in 2025?
But two reasons why I don't think it's going to happen. One, because it would be unacceptable in Latin America, this kind of invasion. Maybe President Milei from Argentina would applaud it, but I would doubt that any other president in Latin America, any other government in Latin America would accept that. That's the first thing. Second, most of the analysts that I have read that have gone through this situation have reached the conclusion that there won't be an invasion. Hernando Capriles, who was a candidate for the opposition in Venezuela, gave an interview a couple of days ago saying that he didn't think it was possible because those people who want an invasion don't know what's happening, but don't know what an invasion means. It's very difficult for the United States to use the old tactics of until the 1980s to get away with regime change. It's very difficult for that to happen. On the other hand, we mustn't forget that the opposition is not completely. They will divide between those who agree with an invasion and those who disagree with invasion. Capriles is the most clear example. He's against the invasion. He's a prominent figure of the opposition in Venezuela. So I don't think there's going to be an invasion. And there's something is different. There's something very important here, and it's this. When I visited Venezuela in 2017 as an observer for the local elections, which, by the way, were won by the Chavismo fair and square, I visited a barracks in Lara State, not far from Caracas, an hour flight from Caracas. And in the barracks, there was two big graphics, and these graphics are everywhere in every barrack in Venezuela, where they describe the steps that they will take in case there is an invasion by the United States. The Bolivarian army, as they call it, have been preparing for a possible invasion for a long time. They are well prepared for an invasion. And this scheme was basically saying, look, you come against us, we are going to give you a very hard time. So it would be very difficult for the United States to invade, because it would be rejected by Latin America, even by presidents who criticize Maduro. Again, maybe with the exception of Javier Milei in Argentina, but I don't think it's going to be an invasion. I think this is just basically a macho posture by Trump saying, look, I can do this, don't mess with me. And at the same time, as Paul mentioned before, I think it has a lot to do with negotiating the oil deal with the United States. So no, I doubt there's going to be an invasion for all these reasons that I have said.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank all our guests for joining us in this discussion, Paul Dobson, Javier Farje, and Marten Brienen. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there, @AJ Inside Story. From me, Cyril Vanier, and the entire team here in Doha, bye for now.